Thank you for that prayer. The passage that Craig just read for us a minute ago, if you didn't pick up on it, is an extremely provocative one. It's one that certainly would have been offensive in its time. You've already heard us say this about Amos, that he was a person who was inclined to say offensive things, but this one really takes the cake. I mean, here he targets some of the most important institutions of Jewish religion, the sacrifices, the festivals, the worship services, and speaking in the voice of God, says that they are essentially worthless, that the beautiful music that they sing was simply noise. And I got to be honest, I'm a little bit hesitant to preach on this passage because I'm afraid that modern Christians could very well take the wrong lesson out of it. We might read this passage from Amos and hear him talking about the worthlessness of their festivals and their sacrifices and think, see, that just shows that all of that stuff in the Old Testament about sacrifice and law and all of that was just pointless. It was just holding space until Jesus came. And that's certainly not true. The first 5 books of the Bible spend a long time explaining and setting up this system of proper worship. Jesus continued to participate in this worship system throughout his life, and even Amos himself shows that he cares about it. The intention is not to say that the ceremonies are bad or the rituals are bad, but it is a stinging critique made to make a point about justice. And I think to appreciate it, we really kind of need to step away from these analogies and critiques of an ancient institution, one that isn't as close to us, and think of something maybe that's a little closer to home. An example that comes to mind for me is that back in 2020, there were a series of protests and calls and even acts of demonstration at the University of Washington in Seattle to take down a statue of George Washington. Now, you might be aware that this was going on right after the Black Lives Matter movement, right after George Floyd was killed, and there was a lot of activism on people's minds. And we heard about some Confederate soldiers' statues being taken down in the South, and maybe if you're a Northerner at least, you kind of cheer for that. But to hear that George Washington statue was being called to be taken down. Maybe that doesn't affect those of you who grew up in Mennonite homes and never had any appreciation for any military figure. But for someone like me who grew up in the public school system and not in a Mennonite home, Washington was a person whom I was taught to respect, whom I still, to a certain extent, respect. I mean, he was certainly a person of high ethical standards. He was deeply admired by his troops at the time because he would never send people into a war or a situation that he himself wasn't willing to go into. And at 2 crucial moments in early U.S. history, when he was in the most powerful position and could have exerted king-like authority over this new emerging nation, he chose not to. He quietly stepped down and stepped away from power so that a just system could exist in this new experiment of democracy. And that, in the course of world history, is remarkable. There are many examples of people who exploited power vacuums and used them to push their own will, and very few of people who made a choice to step away. So there are many folks who not only admire Washington, but who feel a sense of of indebtedness to him, right? As this important moral figure. It's why there are statues in his honor all around the country. So it makes you wonder, why would anybody then call for a statue like that to be taken down? Well, simply put, because Washington was a slave owner. He owned and exploited many slaves. And many people consider this to be disqualifying. If you are willing to exploit other human beings, then you should not be literally put on a pedestal for everybody to commemorate and honor. But I gotta say, I mean, like, this one was one that I felt torn up about, right? Because no doubt that's true, right? Like the slavery is evil, but the other stuff was so good, right? And so myself and many other people are find ourselves trying to reconcile these two very different feelings about a person like Washington. And a phrase that maybe you hear people say from time to time to deal with it is, well, yes, he was a slave owner, but he lived at a different time, right? Now, I mean, factually, that's true. He lived at a different time. But what people are often implying by that is that maybe Washington should be a little bit justified or treated more lightly because he lived in a time when slavery was widespread and therefore was excusable. Well, if we use that phrase to justify someone like Washington, then that's a problem for a number of reasons. It's a problem, first of all, because that's not how morality works. Things don't become moral or immoral because more or less people recognize it. It's true that specific rules change in different contexts. We have to think about how morality applies, but principles like you shouldn't exploit other human beings for your own profit hold pretty true in all places and all times. It's also problematic because it disregards the experience of the actual slaves, who very clearly were not okay with it at the time that it was happening. Now, we don't have very many written testimonies of slaves at that time from Washington's estate because it just wasn't an option for many people. But we do know that 47 slaves ran away from Washington's estate, meaning that it clearly wasn't a place where people wanted to be, including one individual named Hercules Porce, who was one of the most esteemed ones. He was his personal cook. He took him with him to the White House. He held him up as a model. But even this individual, when he had the opportunity to get away from Washington, took it, because slavery was a cruel institution. But I think the third thing that maybe people get confused about when they use this phrase, and the one that I want to focus on for the purposes of Amos, is this idea that Washington maybe didn't know that slavery was wrong. You know, you're in a different time, lots of people are accepting it, and maybe he just didn't know. He was ignorant about it. Well, that's actually not true. There are records, there's evidence that Washington himself was increasingly troubled by the practice of slavery throughout his life. He privately talked with people who were abolitionists and let them know that he sort of saw their point and was on their side, but he wasn't willing to take a public stance about it. He made plans for his slaves to be emancipated, but only after he and his wife had died, and so it didn't have any real personal cost on him. And those plans actually didn't work. When he wasn't alive to make sure that they were emancipated, the next generation of people made sure that they weren't. So the fact is that he did know that it was wrong, It's just that there weren't enough voices in society like there are in our society saying this is absolutely a wrong practice. There wasn't the same sense that he would be respected and admired universally for taking this kind of a controversial step. He knew that it was wrong, but it was the kind of thing that you could get away with doing in his time. And that is something that I think tarnishes his legacy. And it's also the kind of thing that Amos is concerned about here in chapter 5. It's not so much that the Israelites were these terrible people who were committing horrific, violent crimes against one another. It's that their entire society had become kind of corrupt. Bribery had become widespread. It was just kind of the way that you did things. You gave a bribe if you had the money and you needed to get a good outcome. You accepted it if you were a judge or a ruler or a person of some power. It was just kind of one of the perks that went with the job, right? The way that they treated the poor, maybe it wasn't super nice to the poor, but that's just the way that markets work, right? Like everybody kind of has to look out for themselves, and when the money comes in, maybe it's a blessing that comes from God. And the problem is that folks like that do know at some level that these practices are wrong. But sometimes they use religion and the image of morality to kind of hide from that criticism. I'm still a good person. I'm a person who goes to the festivals. I'm a person who participates in the sacrifices. I sing the music, and so I must be right with God, even if I'm not perfect in these kinds of ways. And I imagine that if we look closely at ourselves, we could find some things like that too. Maybe we don't own slaves in the same way that someone like Washington did, but maybe we purchase products that are convenient, that come from slave labor. Maybe we have gotten used to being wasteful and exploitative as consumers in a way that we know is probably wrong, but everybody does it. It's generally accepted. Maybe it has to do with the way that we relate to other people in our communities, people that we know we should probably forgive, but we don't want to, resentments that we should probably deal with, but it's just too messy. And so we kind of create these boundaries in our lives when we come to church, when we interact with God, where we say, yes, God, we want to worship, but we're just not going to deal with this, right? We are okay with this part of our lives not being open to God. And nobody seems to be getting upset at us about those kinds of things, except perhaps God herself. Because what we hear through the voice of Amos is that God is irate when religious people blindly ignore justice. When we can participate in these religious festivals that are designed to convict us, to change us, to make us more like God, and instead they reinforce that we are okay continuing in our lives in ways that are self-seeking and harmful to others. God is not okay with that. God considers those kinds of songs and that kind of worship to be religious noise. So there's a challenge that tries to break through our comfort zones and say, no, you need to break down the walls, the dams, these these borders that you have created in your life that say, this is the area of my life that I'm willing to work on, and this is the area of my life that I'm not. And it's a scary thought, because we think, oh man, but there's where can this go, right? Like, if you tried to live completely in line with every just cause, it seems to be impossible. If you have to be Christ-like in all of your relationships, you might get beat up and exhausted. If we try to give our whole selves to God, maybe we can't make it. But there's also a hope in this passage, because it doesn't say that we have to make it happen. We don't have to establish justice. We just have to let it flow. You see, God already has not only the will, but also the power to transform us, to bring the kind of change in our lives that makes us whole and that can transform the world too. All we have to do is take down those walls and let justice flow like a river, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. May we have the courage to let God flow through us, even in those ways that we hide and fear today.